Hey everyone. You'll notice I'm wearing the TOS shirt. That's because there's not much to cover from TAS for reasons I'll cover in a minute. But thought I'd do a go ahead and the finale thing, right? I mean, I've done that for every show I've covered so far. By the way, you want to hear a weird thought? This just occurred to me today as I was doing some prep work, right? I have covered all of Voyager, Babylon 5, TNG, DS9, Enterprise, TOS, TAS, MLP, and by the time this will have gone live, I will have also finished covering Justified, or at least Season 1 of Justified. So I'll take that off the list, but that's still 8 shows I've covered to completion by this point. I never realized this would take off? We'll go take off, the way it did when I started. Actually, I've covered Clone Wars too, haven't I? And Young Justice. And Rebels. I never realized that me covering shows would take off the way it would. Maybe it's just because it was Star Trek for some of the big things. I don't know. You can tell me in the comments, you're dumb. I only care about Star Trek. And that's valid. I am dumb, and maybe you only care about Star Trek. But it's interesting because we have a queue of shows that we're going to be looking at over the coming year or so from your perspective. So I'm not exactly lacking for material there. For those of you wondering, every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have what I call a streamination, where I basically do a live rumination of a given episode from a given show. By the time this goes live, we should have moved on to Arcane, I'm pretty sure. But it doesn't really matter. You can see on the website what shows we're covering and a rough schedule and all sorts of fun stuff like that. But the point is that I never really thought this would kind of become something I would do this long term, you know. It's something I'll talk about more on the actual finale video, which will be going live 2 days from now, that I'll be recording right after this, is how much of a thing this feels like. But it's doubly weird because for me, I finished Star Trek 2 years ago. No, seriously, the last TAS episode you saw, I recorded at this point 22 months ago. So it's been 22 months since last week. You know me. I like to do things in advance. I like to do that. Have that backlog, or not backlog. The opposite of a backlog. I guess it is kind of a backlog. Look, let's talk about Trek, because I like statistics and I like to poll people. And I was like, hey, what's your favorites and least favorites? And you're probably wondering why I keep stuttering over that. Well, because we made it a big thing when we covered Voyager and Babylon 5 and TNG and DS9. And I got hundreds, anywhere from about 219 to about 300 something responses for each of those. Lots of it. Took a lot of work to tabulate, put up a whole visual guide thing. For the combination of TOS, TAS, and Enterprise, I got 19. Now, in hindsight, I should have seen that coming. Just there's not that many people who just have an opinion on these shows, as opposed to, the giants and the juggernauts that TNG and DS9 are. But I'll admit, even I was surprised by how tiny that number was. So, without further ado, let's start at the bottom. So, of this, I should probably mention something else. Of those 19, not every person voted for all 3 shows either. So, yeah. So let's start with TAS, because I got a grand total of 6 people voting for TAS. That didn't surprise me at all. In fact, I wasn't even going to do a post-TAS thing, but then one of my viewers specifically requested I do. And I am, as ever, your dancing monkey. So, worst TAS episode. 1 vote each for the ambergris element, which I don't remember. The counterclock incident, which is actually the series finale. It's the one where they kind of reverse time, and it's weird. And Once Upon a Planet, which, it's pretty dumb. And then we have 2 votes each for the Lorelei signal. That's the one where the sirens manage to mind control the people on the ship. Only the guys, though. Let's not get into it. Practical Joker, the only lamentation I gave the show, enough said. And, of course, Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. Don't actually remember that one. 3 people voted against Mud's Passion. I'm a little bit surprised by that, because that's a number 2 slot at this point. I know there's only 6 thing here, but 3 votes for Mud's Passion, because that was one of the few episodes they actually put some real effort and work into, and, got the actor back and all that fun stuff. And yeah, giant exploding tribbles, and what does not surprise me at all is the one at the bottom. If you asked me before I covered TAS what my least favorite TAS episode is, it would be The Magics of Megas 2. Duh. It's the episode where Spock is like, magic exists. And then he starts casting magic. Because magic exists and the devil is real. I really feel like that speaks for itself. The whole episode is just whatever, but honestly, that explains a lot of TAS. And if you were paying attention during the reviews, and I don't blame you if you weren't, because I feel like nobody actually watched those, I was a lot more lenient on TAS than I thought I would be. Because, to go back to my review system, which I'll talk about more in a minute, if I was to do a pluses and a minuses thing for every episode of TAS, all of them, 100% of them, would just be like, yep, negatives for animation, negatives for asset reuse, negatives for color design, negatives for all the presentation stuff, because it all sucks. But what I did when I was, going through for the ruminations, which are not reviews, obviously, is I just kind of took all the visual presentation side of things sucks thing, threw it out a window and said, okay, so let's look at the episode and try to discuss the actual episode and the plot and the characters, all that fun stuff. And it was nice hearing James Doohan voicing basically every character. And I'm not really joking about that. He's a good actor. But that brings us to the best. This one was interesting. So 1 vote each for The Jihad, don't remember it. Practical Joker, the only lamentation I gave the show. Time Trap, don't remember it. And Pirates of Orion, I agree with that one. That was the beginning of season 2 and probably the second best episode for me overall. Then, of course, we have Eye of the Beholder. Don't remember it. What do you want from me? The Slaver Weapon. That one doesn't surprise me in the number 2 slot, because I'm pretty sure a lot of people like that because of the story it's based on, and because of the connectivity between the settings and all that stuff that I covered in the video proper. But the one at the top is a surprise to absolutely no one. Yesteryear. Because, of course, everybody likes Yesteryear. It's a big Spock-centric episode. It's one of the only episodes that they considered as canon when designing Spock in the future and writing for him. Even though I don't think they directly reference it, they definitely had it in mind when writing for him. So, yeah, no, that tracks. I'm with it. Cool. And that's kind of it. So now you're probably thinking, we've got a bunch of statistics and stuff for TAS for us, don't you? Not really. TAS, as I'll discuss in a minute, TAS was so honestly unmemorable, if I might be so bold. Something I'll talk about tomorrow, aka about half an hour ago, is that there's bad and then there's unmemorable. There's just the middle ground stuff. Below average, green on the scale. And that's kind of the animated series in a nutshell. There's a couple of cool and interesting ideas, and there's a couple of dreck, but for the most part, I'm never watching that show again. Not even like some of the good episodes. I have no desire to touch upon that ever again. And that's all I have to say about TAS. Sorry. Let's switch over to TOS, which I will actually watch again, because one of the things that struck me when I was going back through TOS was how good some of the good episodes were. And if I might be so bold, obviously presentation matters to me. I just talked about that with regards to the animated series. But presentation doesn't just have to be on the technical or the money side of things. There are ways to present something very well, even when you don't have much of a budget. Anybody who's played Undertale can understand that. So TOS actually had some really good presentation occasionally, in the ways they showed the actors reacting to each other, or the ways they would have the musical cues specifically be for certain moments, or in the ways that they would design the sets and have the camera be used throughout those sets. Right off the top of my head, Amok Time. They made sure to have what looks like an intimate camera focus, And as they do this, they kind of pull back a little bit so we can see Spock's back, and we see that Leonard Nimoy is almost nervously gripping something sharp like a knife or a dagger. I forget if it actually was a dagger, forgive me. And there's a moment, and they designed the layout of this room and the blocking so that Kirk can see this briefly in the middle of his thing and just pause for just a second before continuing. Like, okay, I'm going to choose to move on from that. It's a great moment, and it's presentation. And that's what I mean. Every now and again, the presentation of TOS just clicked for me. And it goes back to something I've talked about a lot in my game reviews, because I've covered games from the early NES era, from the early 80s, all the way up to, last year, 2022. And that is a hell of a spread in terms of technology and systems and resources. But something I have always argued strongly and believe firmly, especially since I have so much evidence backing me up at this point, is that good design is good design, whether it was made in the 60s, the 80s, or the aughts. And I stand by that with TOS in particular. Sorry, that's kind of a long, rambling way to get up to this. But my point is, when TOS shined, in my opinion, it friggity shined. And I never really appreciated that before. One of the things I used to be quoted at was TOS had a little bit of Twilight Zone effect, where the episodes were either great or terrible. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I never really processed how great the great was. Because, as I've talked about, I was never really a TOS person. It wasn't until TNG that I really clicked with Star Trek, really became a Trek fan. Obviously, the movies had a big influence on that as well, but the movies are their own thing. Like, there's TOS, TAS, movies, TNG, DS9, Voyager, Enterprise, right? Like, that's Trek. And I'll talk more about that on Wednesday. But it's a different thing. I never really got into it, except this time around. I definitely have a VHS list for TOS, and I definitely will look forward to rewatching some of these episodes, especially when I'm doing some boring editing work or other stuff where I can just kind of turn off my brain and get some boring paperwork stuff done, right? But I'm getting a little bit off topic. Let's talk about your votes, because obviously you voted to get me a spam email right now from Patreon, no less. Hey, that's cool. Hey, I'm just going to delete that. There we go. Deleted forever. Thanks for playing. A lot of you, we'll do the versed. We'll do it the same way. A lot of you voted for a lot of episodes. There's a hell of a spread here. So all of these episodes, I'm going to rapid fire a little bit because they all got one vote each. Wolf in the Fold. A little surprised by that, but okay. Private Little War. Yeah, that sucked. I think we gave that a lamentation. Mark of Gideon. Yeah, I thought I would like that one, and then I watched it. Lights of Zetar. Ugh, how many of you even remember that one? The Empath. Same question. Assignment Earth. Backdoor Pilots. Enough said. Requiem for Methuselah. How many of you remember that one? The Changeling. Charlie X. Yeah, early TOS had some problems. And of course, to nobody's surprise, Spock's brain. Actually, some of you might be surprised, including me. As I'll talk about tomorrow, a lot of episodes, a lot of individual works or games or shows or movies or whatever, they tend to get exaggerated and distended, warped, if you will, in cultural consciousness. Something I've talked about before. Everyone's like, I will do an impression of Shatner. But he doesn't actually talk that way. There's maybe like 4 or 5 times across Trek, across 2 shows and a series of movies that he actually talks like that. But that's how he got exaggerated. That's how he got remembered and memed on. And that's how mimetic mutation works. So Spock's brain is rather infamous for being bad, for obvious reasons. It is a bad episode, but if you remember, I did not give it lamentation status, and honestly, that's something I stand behind. It's ridiculous and stupid, but I don't think it's, terrible territory. I don't think it has what is necessary to really be scraping towards the bottom of the barrel. But it's the one everyone knows about. In my comment section, back when I first talked about covering TOS, one of the most common comments I got was, "Bet you Spock's brain will be a lamentation." When it was like the next week's episode, and everyone in the previous week's comments were like, "Next week's gonna be a lamentation," because everyone thinks Spock's brain's terrible. So only one person voting for that surprised me a little bit. But then again, 19 people. And as a reminder, not all of those 19 people voted for all 3 shows. So, I think we actually had 12 people specifically voting for TOS. Moving on. 2 people voted for Miri, yeah, and the alternative factor. I believe that was our first lamentation, and God, that episode sucked. Just top to bottom, that episode sucked. Cat's Paw got 3 votes. I know at least one viewer who specifically thought of Cat's Paw as the worst episode, the second worst episode, and one of their first lamentations that they gave. Obviously, I didn't give it, but yeah, I can't argue that. But here's the funny thing. If you've been paying attention, it's been 1 vote, 2 vote, 3 votes. The top 3 are a little bit different. So in the number 3 slot with 7 votes, we have And the Children Shall Lead. The episode that I used to presume was my 3rd least favorite, which... yeah, it kind of is. So I suppose that's super accurate, which, of course, leads us into my personal 2nd least favorite episode. That's a lie. I'll get to it. The actual second one from your perspective is, with 9 votes, The Way to Eden. I have said for years, and I've said this on camera and I've said this on stream several times, I have said for years that The Way to Eden is my personal least favorite Trek episode of TOS. And I was wrong. It's my 2nd least favorite, which... you know where this is going. With 11 votes, Turnabout Intruder. I don't have anything funny to say about Turnabout Intruder. Turnabout Intruder pissed me off. It's the only episode that isn't a movie that I've ever considered in contention for Threshold. Let's do some positivity. You like positive? I like positive stuff. Do I have anything positive here? I've got a shark. Sharks are positive, right? He's so cute. Look at him. Oh, Christmas gift from my sister. Hey. Positivity. Now, this is funny because there was a huge spread on the pluses. So I'm going to rapid fire these a little bit, right? So, right on the top, we've got, with 1 vote each, a shark falling off of Laura's head. We've got Shore Leave, which is exactly what it sounds like. That's the not holodeck planet, where no man has gone before. The pilot, the real pilot, and the one that is actually pretty good upon hindsight. In fact, I think I personally vote that as my 2nd favorite pilot of the Treks, right behind Emissary. Taste of Armageddon. Yep. No, that one, I didn't realize how much I liked that episode until I went through with analysis mode, and that was actually a surprisingly good one. Court Martial. I didn't like that one. But it's an episode about bunnies, I think. Then we have I, Mud. That's a funny one. It's probably one of my favorite comedy episodes, despite the fact that there's this big thread throughout the course of it. The Menagerie, the other court-martial episode, and of course the way in which they could get the original pilot in, at least in bits and pieces. With 2 votes each, a piece of the action, another comedy bit, and probably my 2nd favorite comedy episode in the show. Journey to Babel. Little surprised this one isn't higher on the list, if I'm being completely honest. That's a damn good episode, and of course has the amazing Mark Leonard. Devil in the Dark. Seminal Star Trek. Someone actually asked me yesterday from my perspective, so about 2.5 months ago from your perspective. Someone just asked me, what is the most seminal Trek episode? Like, if you wanted someone to sit down and say, this is Star Trek, in one episode, what would you pick? And I came up with 2 answers. One is Devil in the Dark from TOS, and the other is actually The Survivor over in TNG Season 3. And I stand by that. Both of these, neither of these have a big existential threat, which is where Star Trek tends to be at its best, in my opinion. And both of these really work well as character-focused pieces and cutting to the core of what Star Trek is, in my opinion, of course, and that is idealism. I'm probably going to get some comments about that when the Trek Rewrite episodes start going live, but I mean that. Idealism is something that I firmly believe in, as weird as that may sound, and the idea of trying to strive for something better or to be better is awesome. To be able to turn an enemy into an ally, that's Trek at its core, for me. So, with it, moving on, we then have Mirror, Mirror. A great episode that unfortunately gave us the Mirror Universe. With 3 votes each, I'm telling you, this is just a spread. 3 votes each. We have Space Seed, Khan, Nuff Said. The Doomsday Machine, Nuff Said. Probably the episode that benefited the most from the Blu-rays. Conscience of the King. Yep, nope, that's another great character piece, mostly focused on Kirk. Errand of Mercy, the introduction of the Klingons to the franchise. Trouble with Tribbles, the other and arguably best of the comedy episodes. None of that's surprising. But then this one's a little bit surprising because also tied with 3 votes was City on the Edge of Forever. I just mentioned this with regards to Spock's brain, but when people mention the best episode of TOS, almost everyone says it's City on the Edge of Forever. Now, I don't. I actually can think of several episodes I consider better than that, including the 2 that are above this on the Walker choice. But the fact of the matter is that tends to be the high cultural consciousness. Everyone agrees it's the best episode, so I was a little surprised it was that low. But it's still a damn good episode, which of course leads us to the top 2. In the number 2 slot, with 6 votes, Amok Time. This is my personal favorite, for the curious. Amok Time is perfection in so many ways. Even the silliness of the Vulcans, for once, actually works for me because of how much it informs the Vulcan culture and the Vulcan psyche. We get so much insight into how they operate and why they operate in such a ritualistic fashion. This is going to sound like a weird analogy. Real-life medicine, in many ways, isn't about curing. It's about doing stuff that we have observed through years and years and years of research helps us to be cured. And that's what I mean by the ritual, right? We do X, Y, and Z because it happens to work. How many of you have ever had to do something like that, either professionally or personally? Maybe it's with a computer, maybe it's with like an engineering project or a specific piece of software, or even a video game. You're not 100% sure why it works, but it works, and that's the Vulcans. The way that they have this whole charade and this whole thing just leans so perfectly into that. And that's before we get into the amazing character bits for all 3 of the big 3. All of them shine in this episode. And there's so much good stuff. I could gush about it forever. Jim! Which leads us to your most voted for episode, Balance of Terror, which is my personal second favorite. It's surprising given how early on it is in the show, but Balance of Terror is awesome. Now, a lot of it, what it is taking from, existing submarine stories. So, they had a bit of a framework to work with, but I still think they do some really, really good stuff with it. And the aforementioned awesome Mark Leonard absolutely freaking nails it. Now, I'm not quite done. I've got a couple more statistics and sheets for you. Don't worry. I'll try to make this as non-boring as possible. Hang on. So, if we look first at column B, we will... no, I'm not going to do that. Although... I'm told I have this weird librarian look if I do this. I'm not sure if that's actually true or not. What I do know is true is that I do have a bunch of boring stats for you. So let's talk about rating. About 4 or 5 years ago, I forget exactly, we started covering a show called My Little Pony in the Streaminations. It was partially done to establish the Streamination format, which we are now using as our method of covering shows, like we have since used to cover Justified. By the time this comes out, we should be covering Arcane. I don't remember if I've already mentioned that or not, but the point remaining, that it was our proof of concept. It worked great. Everything's cool. But as we were going through, someone suggested, why don't you review the episodes too? Now, for those of you who are scratching your heads, I've never reviewed episodes really, with the possible exception of the Lamentation Status. That was it. I would talk about an episode, but the only review I ever gave was, is it the worst? And even the definition of lamentation changed several times. As some of you may remember, back in Voyager, we only gave 1 episode of all of Voyager Lamentation because at the time, the definition was the worst episode of an entire show, which was Threshold. When we got to TNG, we redefined that twice until we got to the current definition, which is, I'm not going to bore you with right now. So that was it. Ruminations are not reviews. But someone said, why don't you start reviewing them just for fun? I was like, okay. And I'm going to skip some of the boring math, but you know me, I did some due diligence and thought about it. And I came up with a system where we give everything a rank from what is essentially 1 to 7. At the very top, we have purples, reds, oranges, yellows, greens, blues, blacks. At the very bottom, we have lamentations, and then we have awful, below average, average, above average, good, and great. And you need an extra little bit of oomph to be at the very bottom or at the very top. We could have done the pluses and the minuses system, which is what I use for reviewing video games and hopefully someday movies. But honestly, that was just going to add a whole lot of extra paperwork time to something I was doing twice a week anyways in relatively quick format. And I just didn't want to do that. So this is the system we came up with. The reason I'm bringing all this up is that system was well in place and well used and well proven as working when I started covering TOS and Enterprise. So I happened to be using that system quietly in the background as I was going through the show. So I've got all their rankings here. I've got a whole list of every episode and those ranks. I thought it'd be cool to see the relative quality. We'll be doing this for Enterprise as well. Not TAS, though. So let's just go with some raw figures first. Statistics is all about raw figures, presented figures, and interpreted, right? That's the 3 layers. So raw data, 7 lamentations, 23 blues, 14 greens, 13 yellows, 10 oranges, 5 reds, 8 purples. That's a hell of a spread. That is an impressive spread, if I'm being honest. But the thing that I want you to look at that, because I know we're not interpretive yet, but even just looking at that raw data, you can think, wow, that is all over the place. Unlike most shows tend to gravitate towards something. Like Enterprise, for example, I'm just going to spoil this for you, had a whole lot of greens, like a huge portion of greens. But, and I'll go ahead and show up the pie chart right about now, as you can see, this is actually surprisingly even of a spread. The only thing which is underrepresented is reds at the expense of more blues. That is fascinating, because what that means is TOS has such a gradient of quality that it hits every single mark on the rainbow, literally. But that makes sense, doesn't it? Remember what I just said about the Twilight Zone thing? Greats and bads? Well, I happened to get a chart going, because I was curious. I wanted to see how the quality went per episode as it was going. And here's the chart. I don't know where I'm going to put it. I'll figure it out in post. I'm probably going to cover my stupid, dumb, ugly face with it. But check that chart out. Look at that. Look at that bounce. Like, it starts off kind of average-ish, and then there's a really good episode, and then a bad one, then a good, and then a bad, and it's a freaking yo-yo. Now, even from this, we can see a couple of trends. First of all, you'll notice I did add the average line. That's the red line going throughout. That generally rose the entire show's run up until, what is that? Looks like it's mid-season 2. Hang on. I'll give you the exact episode. Give me a second. The exact episode would be Trouble with Tribbles. Yeah, no, that's right. Season 2, episode 13. So the overall average quality of the show continued to rise until that episode. And then it steadily went down for the entire rest of the show. And I can point to that episode specifically because if you look at the chart, you notice there's one last spike that hits a 7. That's purple, way at the top. Nothing ever hits 7 after that. There's a couple of 6s, and there's, looks like 4 5s. But everything else just kind of starts averaging down in quality. And honestly, that's season 3 in a nutshell, isn't it? But hang on. I've got even more boring statistics for you. Check this out. Because that's the whole show. Yo-yo, average. Let's look at each season. This is fascinating to me. So check this out. Season 1, you can see it right there, somewhere on your screen. Season 1 has a lot of average, which is surprising. But what it also has is a little bit of red, decent chunk of orange, big chunk of blue and green. Looks like 1 lamentation. Yep, 1 lamentation. And then a solid 4 purples. That is not exactly terrible. But then you look at season 2, and season 2 gets interesting. So we have an increased amount of greens. Blues have actually shrunk. We have an additional lamentation. Much less average. Same amount of orange, same amount above average, more greats, and same amount of, or more good, and same amount of greats. So the overall quality of season 2 increased. And season 2 right there, that's TOS. If I was just to give you an image, that's TOS right there. That spread of everything from top to bottom, and a mostly even spread thereof, with a couple of exceptions. But then there's season 3. Over half of the blue episodes of this entire show are in season 3. And as you can see, there's more lamentations. The blues are awful. There's actually less greens and less yellows. There are a couple oranges, a couple reds. 3 oranges, and 2 reds. But that's... This is going to sound strange. But upon reviewing, season 3 was actually better than I thought it would be. Because what did I remember except for the stuff at the bottom, right? That's what I talked about earlier. But hang on, I got one last little tidbit for you, and then I'll leave you be. Because when you're creating a long-form work, what you want is above average and higher, right? That's your target, right? You don't want average episodes or comic issues or entries in a game series. You want everything to be above average and higher. And if you look at it from that metric across the 7, it can actually be divided into just 2. Everything above average and up is good. Everything average and below is bad. Now, obviously, that's a more binary way to look at it, but it does give a little bit of insight into how well a particular long-form fiction is doing, in my opinion. Especially since, again, that's the goal. And I'll be doing this again for Enterprise tomorrow, so that should be fun to compare and contrast. But the reason I bring this up is if you look at TOS, that's the spread. That is an interesting spread. Season 1, honestly, that's not great. That's kind of average when it comes to show design. Season 2, much better. Obviously still not great, but a substantially better overall thing. And then Season 3, oof. And that is the original series. It has been interesting and honestly a treat to cover this show, despite some of the oofs that I just mentioned. Tomorrow, we'll have the Enterprise finale, and then Wednesday, we'll have the Trek finale. Hope to see you there.